Hey folks, Mark from Nomad Boatbuilding. Now this week, something special. We're on Gabriola Island, BC, and we're visiting the shop of a friend of mine named Tony Grove. Now Tony is a boat builder, he's an artist, and he runs a school of woodworking. And Tony and I met a long time ago when I first got out of boat building school, and I came along snooping around his shop, hitting him up for a job. Well, he didn't have a job for me, but he did have a friendship for me that's lasted over 25 years now. And Tony and I have worked together a little bit, we've taught together, and today we're going to go work on corking a boat together. So Tony is working on Canada's oldest registered sailboat called the Dorothy, and right now he's in the stage of construction where he's caulking the boat, or corking it as we call them. We're going to go in and we're going to have a look at it, and we're going to learn about the basic tools and techniques of corking a boat. You can hear Tony getting to work, so let's go join him. Corking is a sort of a fascinating technique that allows us to take a Carvel-built boat and make it watertight. It's a very important technique to learn if you want to have anything to do with wooden boats. And it's something that's a real specialty for some people. For myself and for Tony, it's something we only get to do once in a blue moon. So you're not going to see the fast-flying hands of a real pro corker here, but we'll give you the basics of what it's all about. It's certainly enough to give you a feel for tackling it yourself on a small scale.
Dorothy here is in my shop. I'm restoring her for the BC Maritime Museum out of Victoria. And she is the oldest registered functioning sailboat in Canada, built in Victoria in 1897.
What was the name of the guys that built this?
Robertson.
Robertson?
Yeah.
For the company name or just?
No, it was J.J. Robertson was the shipwright, mostly small boats, sailboats.
Where in Victoria were they located?
Down in the harbor, so over near where the Coho comes in.
Oh.
Just over there where that, you know that little white shed that's still there, that little historic building? Right around there.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So the great-great-granddaughter came here to see Dorothy and tell me the stories. Her grandmother used to live on the other side of the Victoria on the harbor, and when she was young, and she was like 10 or something like that, she would take the rowboat and row over to see her dad and have lunch with him and then row back.
Awesome.
Yeah. No seaplanes coming down and taking her out, you know. And apparently, the master shipwright, Robertson, was, they estimated he was in his 60s, 70s when he built this boat. Wow. And he built it with his other crew. But, yeah. Cool. So he was still, and then, you know, for 1897, living that age was quite rare. So, and still working and building.
How did you get into boat building, Tony?
I was lucky enough to start an apprenticeship at Vancouver shipyards. There was a time when I started, the unions had said that there were so many people working, for every 20 people working, they had to have one apprentice. And that time there was a big boom in the shipyard. And they had to bring in apprentices. So I knew somebody there, and I was able to apply for a job and basically pick which apprentice I wanted. Thought, well, I prefer to be creative, so if I go to something like woodworking instead of like electrical or plumbing or machinist, then could be a little bit more creative. And so I went into the wood shop and started an apprenticeship there, which was great because it was called Shipwright then, and it really covered a lot of different subjects or things that I could play with, like from wood to rebuilding a skeleton key lock or putting rubber on an old barge or a tugboat. It was quite broad, really good training, and I could have 6 different jobs in a day, which were completely different, which made it really interesting as well. But it wasn't really specialized. It was more general, so it was all these different things. It wasn't until I actually went away for a little bit, traveled, and then I came back, and then I started wanting to sort of specialize, and I started working for a small little woodworking shop that did mostly just wooden boat repairs and restoration. And so that's when I kind of honed it into just doing wood. And I didn't want to do fiberglass. I didn't want to do the other or steel boats. I wanted to get into just wood, and that's why I specialized in wooden boats.
Okay, just for fun, Tony, we'll both pull out our tools and lay them up side by side and
Okay.
each talk about what we got here, okay? All right, we've got like a caulking tool smackdown going down here.
So
All of my tools, except for like 1 or 2 items, are technically garbage.
okay.
Almost all my irons are Osborne irons, which are just like an off-the-shelf iron that's currently available. And I think like the earliest ones I got were okay, and then the last 1 or 2 I got were just atrocious. And all of them were virtually unusable. And so every one of them I've put a pile of work into modifying them, be it just thinning them out and cleaning up all the working surfaces, or in some cases, like with your crease irons, they didn't come with a crease. I had to put a crease into them.
Yeah.
And then I've taken some of these that were basically the same iron, and I've chopped them down.
Right.
Taken a grinder to them, reduced their width to make these little narrow irons, and put them to the forge to create bent irons.
Yeah.
So I think I got one of them that's actually an old antique iron.
Yeah.
And you can
That's
see,
a nice one. That's
yeah,
a
you
pretty
can
wide
see
one.
how that's been worked over, you
Yeah.
know, just by judging by the
Yeah.
thing. And it was in pretty rough shape when I found it. And I
Yeah.
have looked and looked
Yeah.
and looked and looked. Every time I come across like some big junk pile of tools
Right.
somewhere, I'm always keeping my eyes peeled
yeah,
to
yeah.
see if there's a caulking iron in there, and there almost never is,
yeah.
which seems incredible given how many shipwrights were active on the coast here
Yeah.
over history.
I remember crawling in an old fish boat and then finding an iron tucked
Did you?
away somewhere. Yeah,
Good
that
score.
they had used for, fixing it on the beach or something like that.
Yeah.
Some of these irons too, the ones they sell at the chandlery, are cast as well. And
These are all cast.
Yeah, and so they have a terrible sound to them as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're really hard to work. And then if you drop them on rocks or concrete, you can actually do some serious damage to them as well quite easily.
Yeah, I can believe it.
Yeah.
So I've got, and then we have reefing hooks. So this one is made by a proper blacksmith, and I don't know who made it. I think I got it in Port Townsend.
Yeah, that looks like a Port Townsend.
And so that's a nice hook. I forged this one myself, and actually I'm pretty happy about that. I hadn't been on the
Nice.
forge for a good decade before when I
That's
put that
quite
one together.
a hook in it too.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I was just kind of like, what should I make?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
kept this forge at my disposal, so I just grabbed a piece of steel and started banging this out. And it's probably not quite as useful as that in some ways, but in other ways, mine is a little different than the traditional one, and so I think it does have some use. So the traditional one has got sort of a squared off chisel tip to it, and then it
exactly.
tapers towards its apex here, right?
yeah.
And I guess that is to sort of, it nestles itself into the seam of the plank.
Yeah.
Or is that supposed to grab your
Material easier.
material,
Yeah.
especially your paying compound, and reef
Yeah,
that out?
that's right.
Whereas the ones I've made are not really intended for reefing out the paying material, but they are intended to sort of dig down and try and sneak that last bit of cotton out of the crease
exactly.
without tearing up the seam, which is my plan.
Yeah.
And I tend to use this little one more often than any other one.
Yes.
Because mostly I work on small boats.
Yeah,
too.
yeah, that's right, exactly.
But I've found this incredibly useful over the years, and I've reground this tip I don't know how many times.
Yeah.
And then of course we have
The wheels.
the wheels. You got
For-
a nice one. Mine are
for
junk.
smaller boats.
Yeah.
I made this one, I think in my apprenticeship I made it.
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's got a nice big brass
Yep.
wheel on it. Mine is just made out of a washer, which is why it's got this sort of stumpy reveal, and it's for pretty small seams.
I think I stuck this in a drill press, this wheel, and then used a file to actually
Yeah,
give it that shape
looks nice.
to taper up the outer edges. Yeah.
Yeah, and then this is just your off-the-shelf wheel for putting in screen doors. You got one too. Look at that. Which is interesting in that, especially what I find interesting is that they have the rolled over, the crease iron
That's right.
end, which makes total sense from a caulking point of view or a corking point of view. So now I have heard it said that if you're doing decks, you should just put them in with a wheel as opposed to a hard
Interesting.
iron.
I actually remember doing a very old working tug, and we were redoing the decks, and we actually had to use irons to put the material in, and we used cotton.
I could see in a tug.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A big working boat, and then we poured in tar afterwards. So on top of that, actually, I got a tar dispenser. If you want to see
cool.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got this old tar.
That's
So
awesome.
You fill it up in here,
Yeah.
and then you pull this stopper out, and the stopper's down the bottom.
Yep.
And then when that comes lifts up, then the tar starts pouring out of
Beautiful.
there. And it's made out of metal, so you can actually keep it hot. You can put a torch onto it if you want to get it going again. For me to get this moving again, I would probably put a torch on, a tiger torch or a blowtorch of some kind. And then you just walk along the deck like this,
Yeah.
you pull it up, and you pour it in the seam.
Cool.
Yeah.
So our standard irons for doing most of your corking work are called making and crease irons. Now I differentiate the two. I think of the making iron as the one that we use for stuffing the cotton into the hull, and the crease iron is the one that we use for sort of setting it tight afterwards. So the making irons or crease irons come in a numbering system from 00 or BB through to say number 3. There's probably some larger ones than that. So a number 3, for instance, is usually about a 1/4 inch thick. Number 2 would be a 1/16 less than that. Number 1 would be an 1/8 inch thick, and going down the road towards basically our 00, which is like a knife edge. The reason I differentiate making irons and crease irons is because in my mind a crease iron is one that has to have some thickness to that edge, and as you get larger actually has a little groove filed into that edge, and that is the crease. And as you get into the larger sizes, sometimes they'll have multiple creases in there. But the idea behind the crease is that it sort of like cups the edge of your cotton and helps to drive it down from the edges, making it tighter as opposed to driving it from the very center and forcing it through the seam. The next ones are the butt or nib irons, and usually the nib irons are the narrowest ones like this, and they're intended to do like the nib ends of planking. The butt irons are just narrower again, and they're often for doing the butt ends of planking too, because you get just a smaller span where the butt blocks are. They come in the same variety where you'd have a narrower making iron, and then you would have a heavier crease iron for setting that cotton. Then we have bent irons, same deal. You'd have the thinner ones at the 0, 00 range, and as they get bigger, they get creases in them and the numbers go up. And the bend allows you to sort of get up against places like where the keel meets the planking, and you just can't have that iron coming in at the right angle. You need to have the tail end of that iron bent away so there's room for the mallet to swing. And you get some oddball ones like this offset iron that Tony has here. And again, it's just for getting into tricky spots. You might use this alongside of a stanchion where the seam is vertical alongside the stanchion, but you just can't swing your hammer at it. So this just sort of offsets it a little bit.
So my irons I've picked up over the years. I've maybe found them at antique shops or in the bottom of bilge in a boat maybe. I had an old shipwright came into my shop once, and he had a bunch of tools that he wanted to find a home for. And his family didn't want them because they were shipwright tools. He was a master corker for Kate's tugs, and I wasn't very rich at the time. And so when he was leaving, I said, "So what do you want for the tools, though?" Because I was quite excited about it. And he says, "Well, give me a case of beer and I'll be happy with that." He just wanted it to have a good home. But anyway, so I got a bunch of tools from him, which I really like. I still use some of them. These are all proper iron-made tools. Even this guy here, you can see he's got a bit of rust, and I've had to clean it up as well. That's my setting iron there. So these are all mostly crease irons here, all these ones. This is the one I kind of prefer the most. It has quite a thin face to it, edge to it, but I actually like this one because I can really, it's dangerous. I wouldn't recommend somebody starting out use one like this because you can slice into the wood quite easy. It feels sharp. You could actually cut the cotton as well. But I'm very delicate. I put it in with this, and then I can use this for rolling the cotton in. I can show you that later. And then there's a butt iron here, and that's for doing short little spots where you can't get a larger iron into, and you might have a short little space to do, and that's where you use these little guys. And
Sure, especially when you have like nib ends on your hood ends of your planks. And
exactly,
things like that, right?
or a tight curve or something like that too. Yeah. And then these are my bent ones. These are all bent irons. And they may have been originally not bent, but somebody has customized them at some point. And this would be for maybe a garboard seam that you have trouble getting at. And so you have to get at it from underneath. And this also has a set in it as well, that little groove that's been filed into that edge. I like that one for setting. And then getting into reef irons. This is one of the reef irons I got from that master corker. And surprisingly, it's one of my favorite tools. So he used hardened steel here, or high carbon steel here, on a softer handle, and he had somebody weld it onto it. And then he welded this knuckle onto here too. And the advantage is so if you have a seam coming along like that, you can, two things, you can take your reefing iron, goes into that seam, and then you can take a mallet and you can actually hit on that edge, and that can help bring it out. And then also when you can come along and you get further in, that knuckle rides on the plank below it, and you can use that to actually pry the material out. And I found it works very quickly. This can do a lot of damage, so you do need to, you could hot glue a piece of strip of wood on there to protect the plank if it's soft cedar, but you can use this one to reef out really quickly. And I like the fact of being able to pound it. And again, it has a flat edge to it here, and it's quite sharp, a hook. These ones I make, this is like an old carving knife, and all I did was just cut a hook into it. This
that's
is just
really interesting.
a little steak knife, and I cut that one down with an angle grinder and cut that and made that into a reefing hook. These are for those really tough little ones where you got some cotton buried in the back somewhere and you're just trying to pull it out. And so I've made a couple, and whenever I need one, I'll actually just make one out of an old knife from a thrift store or something. Don't try not to use the ones from the kitchen. Quickly, I got this, always sits in my kit as well, just a piece of cotton. Love the smell of it. Kind of taken on the smell of oakum, which has this pine tarry sort of oakumy smell to it. And this is just my rolling apron that I lay on here if I have to roll the material up. You can see it's a bit thin here, so I might want to take that apart and then just kind of retwist it together here. And then I'll use this action to tie that as one piece again. And I'll be checking it for lumps and bumps and stuff. But this would be my pad is roll that up into my kit for working on so I don't wreck my jeans. So I have a few mallets, and again, I've inherited these over the years from old shipwrights who are not doing it anymore. I have two here. These are probably like a black mesquite that's been used for the head, and then usually a maple for the handle. And then usually you have them so you can take them apart and then fit them into your toolbox. I'd have to force that in there. I'm not using this one anymore, but you can already see where somebody's had to repair it, and they've actually drilled it out and then put a new piece of wood in there because it probably was mushrooming over really bad. And I just don't use that one because I have this one here was my old one, which I use this one for a lot of my caulking. For smaller boats, I might use this one. I just made this one out of some Purple Heart and a maple handle. Maple, I think it's maple. And then just a couple of pieces of pipe for the rings that go in there. And I used a bit of cotton to hold the rings on so they don't keep falling off. And again, then I have a fancy one here, which I do not use. And this is made out of ligament vitae. And this one's just too heavy. But I made this handle a little while. I made this handle in the summertime, and now that it's winter, it's really tight on there. But I leave the end usually sticking up. This one doesn't have that, but the end sticks up a little bit, so you can actually pound the handle out when you want to take it apart, put it in your toolbox. This one's more for show. It's just too fancy. Ligament vitae is too heavy a wood to be using as a mallet. Because you figure, two things. I talked about the sound with the irons and with the mallet. You're kind of going at it, you're banging it all day. You could be doing it for hours and hours, and the noise could be quite deafening, especially with a hard mallet like that.
Yeah.
And then they have the slots that are cut into these. This very traditional shipwright's mallet. The British tend to have a larger head here, and then the smaller parts that come out the end there. So the step is contrast different. But these slots that are put in here are kind of to help give it a bit of a spring and reduce the vibration when you're hitting them all the time. And they also can have make the sound a little more pleasant as well, especially when you're banging it for hours and hours and hours.
I know it's always said that mesquite, black mesquite is your best material for a mallet head. And I know I've found some old Navy or Canadian Navy mallets at one point that were all live oak.
Oh, wow.
I didn't like the live oak ones. I felt when I tried them out, they felt like they were pretty big, but they were not. They're a bit on the light side. And
Right,
when
yeah.
I've tried using a mesquite one, I really can feel like why mesquite is the ideal
Yeah,
material.
yeah.
It seems to have just the right density for the size of the hammer
Yeah.
mallet. And if it's too heavy, it's hard to hang on to.
Yeah.
If it's too light, you need to use too much of a driving force,
Yeah.
which means it's just more wasted energy.
Yeah.
Now mine is made out of ebony, which is not ideal because it's too brittle for
Right.
for a caulking mallet. I didn't make this; I bought it,
Oh.
but still, it served me okay. It is always the rings have never stayed put where they're supposed to, so I got one end is all busted up here,
Right, yeah.
and I think I've got. Yeah, but that's a locust, black locust.
Oh,
for a
nice handle. Yeah.
It is interesting how, now mine is not made to come apart, but it's interesting how most caulking mallets are made to have that handle come out.
Yes. So you can put it in your
So
toolbox.
you can put it in your toolbox.
Yeah, yeah. And this is a nice friction fit. Actually, it doesn't come loose while I'm hitting it away. The other thing too, I find with the size of the head, it actually you'd think that might be awkward to use a continuous mallet, but that shape seems to work nicely with a good force without putting a lot of strain on your wrist for some reason. And so it just has evolved over the years to function very well.
As I've always been told, the long head on these guys is basically, it's because you get your shoulder
Right.
up against the boat, you need enough length there so that this arm isn't trying to work over here, and you've got this swing here, and this is basically taking up, roughly half of your shoulder length.
That's right. That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been kind of cheating a little bit where recently I've been using this dead blow mallet to do some of the caulking on Dorothy. I really like the dead blow. It's got the nice long head as well, but it has the shot inside of it. So when you hit it, you get a true hit. It's not like another type of mallet, which would, when you hit it, bounces off. The shot behind it follows through and gives a bit more force to it. So you have a short range to hit. It's a light mallet too. And the sound, I don't have it's not going ting, ting, ting every time. It's because it's plastic, it actually helps a little bit in some of that. So I sometimes like using this when I'm just by myself and I don't want to annoy the neighbors and stuff.
Got it.
Yeah.
Now let's just take a little look at the materials that we're working with. So the first one is the cotton. So this is unspun in that it's not wound into a strand like a rope. When you acquire this stuff, one of the things you might do is if it's a particularly heavy strand and you need to make it smaller for the boat, you need to split it down. Or you might have to roll a couple of them together. And remember, Tony showed us how he was prepping his material, and that's another thing you would tend to do is you get this out of your bale and you just work it across your knee, rolling it down. And having a nice smooth piece of canvas like Tony had is really helpful because this stuff will start to pill up on your pants pretty fast if you don't have particularly smooth pants. And once it's in a nice sort of contained strand, it's easier to work with and easier to judge how much should get stuffed into your seam. The next step up from that is using oakum. So oakum is a funny material. It's made out of all kinds of different stuff. Typically you would say that it's made out of hemp or some sort of natural fiber like that, but it could also come made out of coconut coir. Depends on where you are in the world. So this is kind of like your roughest stuff. Could be manila, could be sisal. It's usually soaked in some sort of oil or solvent, kind of like diesel fuel. Sometimes it's soaked in something that's like akin to pine tar, but it varies quite a bit. Now this stuff is usually way chunkier, harder to sort of dress down, but it tends to be used only in larger seams and in heavier boats. And historically, oakum would be made from old rope on a boat. So if you have a sailing ship and all the rigging is made out of hemp or flax or anything like that, as it gets old and useless as proper rope, you'd have whatever sailor is sitting around on his ass doing nothing, and he would have him picking oakum. If you read historical texts about sailing, that's referred to a lot, about guys picking oakum. And what that means is they're just sitting there with old bits of rope, and they're just ripping it into little strands in order to bundle it together into this stuff, because you're going to have to caulk the ship at some point, and you need that material on hand to do so. And the last thing I'll show you is this product. I don't even know what to call it. I call it luting. It's a smaller version of this cotton, and it is spun a little bit, but not very finely. And what's odd about it is it's bundled into these strands. So there's 2, 4, 6. There's 8 strands all bundled together here. And this is good for small boats because you might have to caulk a very small seam, and in doing so, you would pull off a strip of it that's the length of your planking, for instance, and then you would just split it down into whatever you need. So perhaps the planking only demands 1 strand, you would peel off 1, or perhaps you might need 2 strands or 3 or 4, or whatever volume you need to fill that seam. Now, if you're working on small boats, and obviously trying to lay your hands on a ball of this stuff is probably pretty challenging, what you can do is you can acquire butchered string, which is usually the same stuff almost. It's usually spun a little bit better, wound a bit better, but if you get a good quality heavy butcher string, it's still just pure cotton. It's still got the softness that we need, and it will do in a pinch. And when I was in Thailand one time, I saw some boat builders there who were caulking a boat, and they were using butcher string as their cotton. And they were painting the seams with a mixture of shellac and plastic resin glue. So they were just taking the powdered plastic resin glue and mixing it with shellac instead of water and using that as a seam painting compound, which is kind of cool to see. How often should you caulk your boat?
There's no real hard, fast rule with it because it depends. If you have like a 150-foot boat, you don't want to have to re-caulk the whole thing. But the kind of general rule of thumb that I was taught was 30 to 40 years, you should do a complete re-caulk. Now, whether that's just below waterline or it's the whole boat, but at some point you should re-caulk the whole thing. Now, this is Dorothy, and she's the oldest sailboat in Canada. Do not believe the boat has been re-caulked ever completely, and I think she's only been spot corked all the way along. So they would have reefed out a small little area that was leaking, probably around the chain plates or down in the garboard or something, and they would have taken that out and then just spot corked it right in there. And it may not have been a professional doing it, probably an amateur. So I found some damage in there as well. So this is where I've taken the opportunity to reef her out and redo her.
Now, do you differentiate between the term caulking and corking?
I kind of use them loosely back and forth.
Yeah, as do I.
I know. When I'm talking, I might throw people off. They're going, are you corking or caulking?
My take on it is that corking is probably just a British colloquialism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
How do you know if your caulking is still good or whether it's shot?
Where I have found caulking to fail, like literally the packing material that's in there, that's working like a gasket. When I found it fails, I found it in a lot of work boats, and mostly down in the garboard or the lower planks where there would be water in the bilge and that sort of thing. And what I'm assuming has happened is people have put either bilge cleaners in there, or they put some heavy lye or some heavy soaps that are in there. And that lye that's in the soap is actually breaking down the fibers of the caulking material. And I've literally gone in to reef some of those seams out, and they come out in little clumps of putty.
Yeah.
And it just looks like goo, and it's not even doing anything at all. There's no fiber strength to it anymore because the stuff's been broken down. That's when I know it's failed. And that's the only time I've seen it fail. Most of the time with a boat like Dorothy, who's quite old, I was reefing out seams and I'm able to pull nice, clean cotton out of there. I can even show you some that's sticking out of the boat that's still probably original.
Okay, and when would you use oakum instead of cotton or a combination thereof?
Yeah. So where I use cotton is in tight seams, and I'm also using it at the back end of a seam. So if I have quite a big seam on a workboat, I might use cotton first to go in the back, and then I use oakum on the front to fill it up and pack it up. Most of the time when I'm using oakum, it's because the seam is quite big, or I'm working with a workboat, which really needs that durability of the material that's going in there because the boat's working so hard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So if you're starting a caulking job, Tony, do you just start at the top and work your way down, or work your way up, start in the middle? What do you do?
No, that's actually a good question too, because it's like when Dorothy was completely reefed, so all her seams were ready to go. And so what I'm doing is in this case, I started at the top. I was just getting familiar with the feel of it, the thickness of the plank, and just kind of started on the top seam. And then I actually started to go from the bottom and work my way up. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I know that I'm going to be doing the bottom tighter than the top. Dorothy's been quite dry for quite a few years, so I do need to think about her. She's going to swell up. She's going to, when the wood swells up, it's going to compress onto the cotton and the material that I'm putting in there. And but I really want her to be dry down here. So when I go up here, I do it a little bit looser. Also, when you are caulking and you're working from the bottom up, you might be slightly moving the plank next to it each time you do it too. So I kind of wanted to, in this case, I work my way up, and then when I get up here, that's going to be my finished size. I also like doing both sides. So I might do 2 planks on this side and then go to the other side and then do 2 planks too. It might not even really matter, but to me it is. I think there's a symmetry of tension being put on the boat. You want to keep it consistent throughout.
Sure.
So this is my last seam to do, and I got one more seam in the same spot on the other side to do.
And I've heard it said that if you were to, for instance, start at the very bottom and just work your way to the shear line, you could be popping that shear plank right off the boat by the time you get there.
And I've heard rumors like that too. They also said if you caulk the boat too tight and then once it swells up. And that's something that I am thinking about too. Dorothy being 125 years old, the wood's not going to spring as much as if it was brand new wood. So because of the lifespan of Dorothy, she's been dry, she's been wet, dry, and wet, dry, and wet. That wood can only do that so many times. So in this case, I'm keeping the caulking on the bottom somewhat tight, and then a bit looser up top. So if she wants to swell a lot, then at least it's going to be able to compress more on the upper planks as well. And I've heard of that too. There was the rumor that you caulk it too tight and then a dry boat and you put it in the water and all of a sudden planks start bouncing off. Mm-hmm. There's too much forgiveness in wood. So there's that as well in the connection between the wood and and where it expands to. Everything's tied together, all the frames are tied together and everything, but they're held together with a roven rivet on this boat. So I do know there's a lot of forgiveness when she starts swelling up. It's not going to break anything.
So why not just take a tube of flexible goo and pour that into the seams, like a polyurethane or a thiacol?
Yeah, right. Why not use a modern material? And you wonder that. So 200 years ago, if they had some sort of polyurethane caulking, would they have just stuck that in all the seams? And then you wonder what the evolution would have been from there. The cotton is an organic material. It's working with the boat. The problem with a lot of those modern materials, say epoxies and that sort of thing, they're too hard. They're like the wood wants to shrink and expand and move and be flexible, and they'll adhere, but they'll break on the wood fiber line, and the glue will just stay there, and then might even squish out, in some cases too. With Dorothy, for instance, being a boat owned by the Maritime Museum, historical vessel, we're doing traditional historical restoration of her and not putting in a modern goop that we don't know what it'll do in 20 years.
Okay.
Where we do know what this will do in 100 years.
Now, when I was in boat building school, the one thing that we were taught was, because of the way we build these boats, we basically have vertical frames and longitudinal planks. And on their own, there's a lot of room for those to scissor back and forth, just
Yes.
like a piece of lattice fencing would do.
Yes.
And the purpose of the caulking, in addition to stopping water from coming through the planking, is to add friction to those planks and to
Right.
lock that up.
Yes.
So
And it's funny you say that, because as I've been caulking her, I'm also like, now I'm hearing her, I'm knocking on her every now and then, and I'm going like, she's a drum now. She's turning into a drum. And that's kind of beautiful. And I know that once she gets saturated again in the ocean and I bring her out, I'm going to do that same thing and I'm going to listen to it and feel how much tighter she is after that as well. And you're right, it does help with the locking in.
Yeah.
When an amateur or somebody who's not paying attention is caulking a boat, they could get nicely into the seam properly like that. But a lot of times, and I found this in Dorothy, some people came in at the wrong angle like this. And so they luckily didn't split any planks, but they made a gouge and they actually ended up pounding the cotton into the wood itself. So I want to make sure there's none of that. I'm also looking at the width of the seam. Am I seeing a lot of light through the seam? And that means that it maybe has been caulked, reefed too many times. So it starts getting frayed every time you reef it out. The wood starts getting frayed away, and then you have to build that seam back up. So with Dorothy, in some of these seams, I actually had to glue new edges onto the upper side of the plank to build up that and get a nice thin seam again. And also I want the seam to look like this. So it's like that inside the boat. It's not going to be open so the cotton goes right through. I want it to be tight so I can pack it in there. If I've cleaned up the seam, it looks good. I will then just start by, I'll put linseed oil in there first. Because linseed oil works as a bit of a preservative. It also helps lubricate the cotton going into the seam. And then when the linseed oil dries, it actually helps lock the cotton in there as well and give a bit of a preservative to the cotton. Once the linseed oil is in there, then I just start, I have to get my cotton and my material ready, cotton or oakum, whatever I'm using. I need to prep that all and roll that up into balls and have that ready to go. I usually like to start from left to right. And in this case, I'll be starting at the stem, going to the stern, and I will start caulking her up there. I always leave a little bit of a tuft hanging out of there because that ties into the new piece that I'll be putting into this seam right here between the stem and the planking. This here is a butt joint here, and this cotton would have looked like that, and then I split it apart so I create a mustache that then ties into the cotton that I'm going along. I want to try and keep a continuous gasket going around all the planking throughout the whole boat. So when I'm getting my cotton, I've rolled it into a ball and I'm keeping it in a bucket that's around my neck here so that it's not sitting on the floor or something and then getting dirty with particles of sawdust and all sorts of other things in it. I'll pull some off the ball because I don't want to be pulling it off the ball as I'm corking. I'm just like, let it come loose. I'll do that every now and then. Take my iron, and then I will start by setting. I want to leave a tail hanging out so that I can tie it into the new run here after.
switch to your corking glasses.
There we go. I can see. Like I was saying, I like to keep a continuous gasket throughout the whole boat. Getting her started. I like doing 2 taps. And the reason is because it kind of tells, the first one tells me what seam and makes sure that I'm going in the right direction, so I'm not going into the wood. And then the second one helps set it. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep a roll of cotton going in, and I'll come back afterwards and reset it. What I might do is I might take the iron and kind of get a feel for the seam. This one's quite tight here, and then it starts opening up down here. So I got to keep that in mind as I'm caulking as well. Also, getting a bit of linseed oil on the iron doesn't less hurt it and actually might even help a little bit. When it gets really tight, I also don't want as much material going into it as well. So I keep that in mind. Now this is a butt joint here. And so I got a kind of a mustache coming off of there. And now I'm gonna split it apart into two and then carry it over into the other, the new material that I'm putting in over top of it. So actually I'm gonna pull that out a bit. So at this point here, I'm finding I don't have, it's not so much as a bird mouth in there now. It's not like that. It's actually kind of a little bit open on the back side. So I need to be careful. I'm not putting cotton through. So I'm actually starting to come back on the cotton itself and bang on the cotton. And I'm also not using the whole iron on the cotton. I'm always keeping part of the cotton or the iron in the seam so that I know that I'm hitting the seam and I'm not going to be hitting the wood around it. If I was to be caulking with the whole iron, then I could easily damage the planking. So now I'm coming back on the cotton.
I call that choking up. Do you use that same term?
Call it what?
I call that choking up.
I've never actually had a name for it. I like that.
Now you got it. I'll rent you that term pretty cheap. I'll just I'll have my team calculate how much mileage you put on the term, and I'll send you a bill at the end of each month.
I like these buckets. These are just these collapsible buckets you get for camping or for boating. So sometimes what I'll do is I don't like going too far. I like to come back and actually start setting it up and make sure that I'm not doing it too tight or too loose. And now what I'm doing is I'm still using the thin one, and I'm taking it on the upper edge of the line of cotton that's on here, and then I'm thinking about it as I'm putting it into the seam that I'm actually rolling it into the seam, which keeps it nice and tight inside there and serving its function. Now you can see I've not made it too tight. Kind of really a feel. I think too, I'm also thinking about here, this is the stem of the boat, and there's a lot of working going on in this area. So I might do a little bit tighter here and maybe slightly not as tight down there in material and packing in material. Because this area, because it works so much, you got the forestay pulling up and you got all this working area here, you got so much tensions happening that this area can work quite a bit. So I want a little more packing, a little tighter in there as well. So keeping that in mind. I've seen sometimes too, when you have all brand new planks and all the seams are exactly the same, some guys go along and they make it look like it's a sewing machine. They're just like flying along. And in this case with Dorothy, I do need to pay attention to where I'm caulking and what I'm doing, because within 2 feet, 3 feet, they can vary quite a bit.
It is pretty impressive when you see a full-time caulker
It's
flying
amazing.
along. It's like the speed they can get is quite incredible, and they make it look so easy, and yet there's so much technique involved in doing that.
Yeah.
And that's where if you're trying to work too fast as a beginner,
Yep.
you're probably going to screw it up and drive in too much cotton or not enough, or drive it right through the plank.
Yeah, and you want to set it in so it's like about maybe a 1/4 of an inch deep, because you want to have a place. I'm using traditional paying materials, and if it's too shallow, then the material's not going to lock in. So I want to have it at least 1/8 of an inch to a 1/4 of an inch in depth. The paying material will stay in there. The other thing too is like when you do a butt seam like this, you really do need to put a lot of material in, or you need to have it tight. So you need to be able to set it quite heavily, because the plank ends do not expand in this direction. They only expand going this way. And so it doesn't really tighten up in here very much. So that's why you need to make sure that is actually working and staying closed, and with caulking going into it.
Now, I know the beginner will generally go way too hard with their hammering, thinking that the job is just like slam that stuff in as tight as possible.
Yeah, I've seen it poking through on the inside,
Yeah.
where really you should be pulling it out and redoing it again.
Okay, so now we're doing what's called setting the cotton.
Yeah.
So how do those two irons differ?
This is just my own personal preference. Some people might have one that's not as sharp as this. I feel confident I can use this one, but I like this one because I'm rolling that cotton in there, and this one allows me to be delicate. It's small for a boat like this, but I can use that quite easily to come up the top edge, and then it's thin enough that it's actually letting me roll that cotton on top of itself and creating a like a string inside there almost. And then the big one is a wider one, and all I'm doing is giving it a final set, and by doing that is trying to keep it all a consistent depth all the way along the surface, where the little guy won't let me do that. It's just really helping me roll the material in.
Okay, Tony, and then why do we put a coat of primer on top of that?
So then after you got these little strands that are kind of stuck here, they're kind of got caught up in some of that linseed oil. So I'm just going to try and roll them in, just get them into the seam. And then afterwards I'll get a primer and I'll paint the seams. That will actually help lock in all the little fibers that are in there. It'll give me a harder surface for when I'm trying to push the paying material on top of it that's going to stick on top of there. And it helps clean up the dust and or just the fraying of the material and lock it down for me. And below waterline, I've used a orange paint here, which is a red lead primer. So below waterline, I'm using red lead primer. Above waterline, I'm just using a regular white primer. Below waterline, it helps with a bit more rot resistance and bugs growing on it when you get the heavy metals in there. And also, if you have it above waterline, the red lead, you would typically use a white lead, but I don't have white lead. So I do have red lead primer, but the white lead doesn't telegraph or show through when you go to put a top paint over top of it. So
And does the red lead taste better than the white? I heard actually that there's always the concern about these kids eating lead paint.
Lead-based
Apparently, lead-based paint, it does actually taste sweet, and kids did eat it because it tasted good.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
any heavy metal like coppers and leads and those sort of things are great for preserving. Bugs don't like it. Rot, funguses don't like it.
The world is running screaming from lead-based paints, except for the world of boat builders that are clamoring to get every drop of it they can while it's around.
And you used to be able to collect old, when we were younger, you could go into an old garage and find the old lead-based paints that's all been evaporated. So it had this nice lead-based slurry on the bottom. You could then add some more talc to it and then turn it into a putty. I just happen to have some lead-based primers that I've just been holding over the years. But because I'm working on Dorothy and we are using historical products to restore her and not going back or not going with, newer contemporary stuff, that I'm using it on Dorothy as well.
Mm-hmm. I've got a few gallons of red lead primer myself that I found at Steve's Tin Marine or something many years back, and I just bought every can they had in the place.
Exactly.
I knew it was gonna
disappear.
So
yeah, I even have a couple cans,
10 gallons or something like that, and it's still sitting on a few. And I think I've still got a gallon of red lead putty as well.
Yeah, a gallon.
Mm-hmm.
Oh wow.
One thing I've done in the past when I'm using red lead primer, especially if I'm going to do like the whole bottom of a boat, I'll put that coat of primer on, and then I'll put a coat of a non-lead based primer right over top of it, so that I can sand that one, and if I start seeing orange, I stop sanding right away, add another, get another coat.
It's funny. I mean, this is something from the shipyards that I learned too. They put a bottom paint underneath the bottom of the ferries and that sort of thing. It's expensive. I mean, it's like hundreds of dollars for 1 gallon, but they have they have 4 different colors they put on. They start with 1, and they can actually see the erosion happening in certain areas because of the color array that starts showing up in each layer. But it is, and that's one of the reasons why it's orange as well, is to show off that that's the lead. You do need to wear a mask maybe, or do it outside. What do they say? Shipwrights had the shortest lifespan out of all the trades because of all the heavy metals they used to use, and pentachlorophenol and all that other nasty bloody wood preservatives and stuff.
It's just because they worked harder.
And worked
themselves to death before all the house carpenters.
harder.
All right, let's throw a little cotton into this thing. I'm just going to start right in the middle here. So let's screw Tony up as much as possible. Now there's actually a thing called a seam brush that is intended for doing this sort of stuff. They're probably made for bigger boats usually, but it's a long, narrow brush with just a single row of bristles on it, and the bristles are only about an inch long, inch and a half long. I was going to bring you a seam brush, Tony, but I forgot it at the last minute.
Right.
Now when I do this, I like to just sort of I'm a single tapper, and like Tony is a double tapper. Now I like to just do a short stretch and then come back and stuff it in and just see how it feels. Get a feel for how much material I'm putting in there. switch to my crease iron to finish it up. Now there's a technique that I learned from an old-time shipwright, and what he taught me was to know when your cotton is set hard enough is in your driving it in is if your iron has just this tiny little bit of bounce back. It's very subtle, but you can feel it just sort of rebounding back off the inside of the planking. That's tight enough. Any tighter than that and you're going to start stuffing it right through the planking, unless you're into sort of a really big heavy barge where there's lots of material and where you can't drive it through quite so easily. You got to remember the back edge of the seam of this is it's very narrow if there's any back edge at all, and any particular Carvel planking seam, usually about 1/4 of the depth of it should be solid, tight fit against the next plank. And if there's not enough of that, if the boat's old and things are opened up, you don't have that contact back there. But if you're on a big heavy boat where you say you've got 2 or 3 inch planking, you might have almost a full inch of full contact wood at the backside, and that can take a lot more pounding than a light soft wood planking like this. So that felt pretty good. I'll try and mimic that same looping as I move forward here. Now the difference between my technique and Tony's is pretty slight. It's mostly that I like to put a finger in behind my cotton to help sort of gauge my loop size as I pull it up. So I come down, I find the point where I think that I want the loop to come up, and then I bring it up and kind of drag it up against the hull with my finger, helping to control that as we come up. So my first pass, I'm just sort of tucking that cotton in, stuffing it in right down the middle, and then I'll come back again, and I'll just do a very strategic tucking in of any strands that are poking out above or below, and I'll try, as Tony was doing, roll them in along one side of the edge of the planking here, being careful not to drive my iron into the planking itself. Once that's done, then I come back with my crease iron. And that looks pretty good. It gives me a pretty good depth for hanging compound to hang in here. Tony, you want to have a look at my seam and tell me if you like the way I'm doing it? You want more cotton in that seam, or
No,
do you like it like that?
Yeah, that looks good. Deep. You didn't go through, eh?
No.
Yeah, no, it looks good. Yeah, I like it.
I can stuff more in there if you want.
And do another row?
Well, or I don't mind, I can reef this. At least back here, I could reef that out.
Right.
That was my first stretch anyway.
Yeah.
I'll do that. It is a bit deep, but
Yeah.
better up here?
I like it here because
Okay.
this is like, that's a lot of putty to put
Sure.
in there.
Okay.
And then you're relying on the putty a lot more too.
Got it. Okay, I'll reef that back out and redo it. Now, while it sounds like I might be hitting this really quite hard, I tell you, my tops are actually quite light. I don't think I could crack a walnut with the weight of the blow that I'm giving this. I'm into a spot right here where the seam is pretty getting a bit ugly and a bit wide, and so I'm using a technique we call choking up or looping, where we kind of bundle up on that cotton a little bit more and we drive it back onto itself, just to sort of create a little more volume in there. Here we have the last of this little strand here. Shred that away a little bit and we'll just kind of wind them together a little. Okay, well there we have it. There's a little taste of corking. It's actually kind of fun to do in a way. Of course, it depends on how big your job is and how much time you have and how much strength is in your arms. It's something that I could not do I could not become a commercial corker. My elbows are just not made for it. I've damaged them earlier on in my career, and so I have to be careful how much of this stuff I do, but I could play around for a couple hours a day doing this sort of stuff if I had to. Okay, that's it for now. We'll be back and help Tony keep on rolling here. Ciao for now, folks.
So Mark, being the last seam on the other side, you know, like there's a whiskey plank. I think there's like a whiskey caulk.
You want to try and rephrase that one? Have you heard it said that the Vikings caulked their boats with the intestines of their enemies? So just keep on going.
Stay here all day and help me if you want.
Well, I'll certainly stick around for a little while and help you.
We can have a whiskey caulk.
That's what got us into this trouble in the first place. We'd be free men living a life of Riley if it weren't for the whiskey cock.